Nice to see you here in .NET Konf 2021.
Hi everyone, I hope you can hear me okay.
Yeah, okay, we can hear you. Nice to
Perfect.
meet, to see you here.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here. Um, and I appreciate you inviting me to the conference.
Thank you. We are sure that audience will enjoy and learn a lot from your presentation and from your experience. It's your turn.
Fantastic. Let me just share my screen so everybody can see it and
Okay.
we can kick this off. Welcome everyone to my session. I appreciate you spending time with me. Today I'm going to be focusing on .NET 6 APIs and security. And with that, let me just kick off my slides. So I work at Microsoft as a PM. I focus on identity and security, and my job is to help developers and IT pros and DevOps people write more secure apps. If you like what you see today and you want to learn more about security, then make sure to check our show. It is a stream that we do a few times during the week, and we focus on end-to-end scenarios around security. So check this out. It's aka.ms45 show. It's on Twitch and YouTube, so you can find us there. All about security. And since it's all about security, I want to explain to you why security is so important and how why we feel that developers need to learn and focus on that. The other day, my manager said, do we have any documentation on creating secure apps? Or imagine your manager coming to you and saying, I want you to write a secure app, or I want you to secure this application. Now, this is a very open-ended topic because it is extremely hard to focus on something. Is it code obfuscation that we're looking to secure? Is it defensive coding that we need to do? Is it about securing access to the application through signing in users and making sure that they can do what they're supposed to be doing through roles and authorization? Is it accessing resources on Azure or some other cloud or maybe on premises? Is it about securing transfer of data or securing data in storage? So as you can see, it is super open-ended and super tricky to focus on security. So today, rather than trying to cover all of these, we're going to focus on how we can build APIs with .NET 6, and we'll look at .NET 6. If you haven't looked at .NET 6, then make sure to check some of the sessions here, and then also make sure the official .NET Conf that took place in November, where we had a lot of PMs from the team talking about all the goodness in C# 10 and .NET 6. We'll see what is different, how we can configure authentication on an API, how we can configure authorization in an API, and then we're also going to look at how we can access resources on Azure without really using any secrets. It is very important to look at that because one of the attack vectors that hackers use these days is finding credentials. Rather than trying to brute force operating system, rather than trying to brute force your architecture, they're going to look for weak points, like somebody checking in a username and a password, or an API key, or a storage key that opens the door to the rest of your infrastructure. So I suppose that throughout your career, as you were developing, you came across a config file or an application that has some secrets stored somewhere. And the problem with that is, even if your code is secure, people are not. Social engineering. Somebody may leave your company after a while and then they still remember or have access to those secrets and they can use them, either maliciously or by mistake. So I'm not going to spend too much time on slides. In fact, that's the only slide I have here. And then we're going to jump straight into demos. And we're going to see how we can build a .NET 6 API, what is new in .NET 6 in terms of APIs and how they work. And then we're gonna start securing the app and go through all the steps of making it work. So I'm going to come out of here and I'm going to open my terminal. So here I need to, open my terminal here. And I'm going to create a brand new API and I will show you how to do that. So .NET new web API, and we're going to, see, I've already done a different demo. We'll say .NET Konf API, right? So with this command, if you were to run this command, it will create a new web API. It will use the new minimal way of doing APIs. It will add authentication, and we have a couple of options for authentication. In fact, if I were to not do that and do help, then we will see that there's a whole lot of options here when it comes to authentication. And you can do, as you can see, many things. The most important one is they can select between B2C and single org, which is the difference between Azure Active Directory, which is one of our identity providers at Microsoft, and then Azure Active Directory B2C, which is the second one. The first one, Azure AD, is for enterprise accounts. So if you are at work, you can use your work email to sign in, whereas B2C is an identity provider that allows you to use your Gmail or your Outlook or some other OpenID Connect provider to authenticate. And then you can pass all the parameters, so it will do a lot of the configuration for you out of the box. But I'm going to go with the vanilla option. So let's bring it up here. Let's do clear. And then let's do this, and then we'll name it .NET Konf, but I'm going to change this to this so we can be consistent. And we're going to create the API. We're going to open the API in Visual Studio Code. You can use whichever editor you like. In fact, we did add support for the same functionality inside JetBrains Rider, if you like JetBrains Rider to work with .NET, or Visual Studio. So here we're going to quickly look. Obviously, I did not change into that directory. It's too early in the morning for me. It is early in the morning, but it's fine. Right, okay, so code. Let's open this. Okie dokie. So what do we have here? We have our new minimal API. As you can see, there are quite a few things missing. Like there's no startup that there used to be before. Everything is in the program.cs now. You also notice that we have top level statements. So there's no namespaces, and there's not many usings here as well, because it's quite implicit in terms of how it runs that. In fact, if you move into the CS Prods file, you'll see that we have implicit usings. So it uses global usings for basic things, and then for everything else you can pull in the usings that you need. So here we have Microsoft Identity.web. So in .NET Core from 3.1 onwards, and in .NET 6, there's a brand new library that allows you to configure authentication. And in the past, I don't know if you ever worked with OpenID Connect, it was quite a bit of a setup, especially in the old .NET days, because you had to use OWIN, and there was a whole bunch, like hundreds of lines of code that you had to configure. Now it becomes extremely easy. It's 2 lines of code. In fact, you can concat that and make it a single line of code by saying .add Microsoft Web API authentication. And in fact, you can remove all that because it can be defaulted, and do this. And now Copilot is trying to be clever. This is all it takes to add the authentication middleware in your application. Easy peasy lemon squeezy. And then obviously you need to make sure they have user authentication and user authorization, because this is what tells the middleware to enforce the authentication rules that you need into your application. But with these 3 lines, we have everything working. Now, there is a bit of a setup that you need to do, and I will show you later on how to do it. But in effect, you would have to come here. You would have to maybe, let me see, I should have my, yeah, so like your Azure Active Directory, you would come here and you would configure an app registration. In some cases, you might be able to do that, but depending on the company that you work for, this could be locked down and you might have to request somebody else to do it for you. And that's always a pain. So we can automate the process, and we can use different ways to configure your app registration. The app registration, in effect, tells your Azure Active Directory that you are going to be using Azure Active Directory to authenticate users and grab an access token, and that token will allow you to call the API. We need an access token to call our APIs. So this is it, 4 lines of configuration and 2 lines of code and 1 library. That's the Microsoft Identity.web. So then we have our controllers. Now I'm going to switch projects because rather than you seeing me typing all the time, it's a lot easier if I show you how the code actually works. So I already have a different project that has that configuration. I'm going to change directory. I'm going to move to authentication. And I will say force checkout, discard 1 file. So here I have the exact same code, but it does a little bit more. So we do have the configuration. We do have our middleware for authentication. And now we have 2 endpoints. Later on, we're going to add Cosmos into our Cosmos DB for our data, but for now, it's just returning empty, like it's just returning strings and says, you have successfully called this API endpoint and you can get some results back. There are 2 endpoints. Now, again, .NET 6 has made it extremely easy to write code for APIs. And you can mix and match as well, even in web apps, but all you have to do is just say app map get and then pass the endpoint that you want, and in here you get access to your context, you can get access to your parameters, and then on line 27, I'll make this bigger so everybody can see it. On line 27 we say I want to require authorization for this endpoint. This is important because if you don't pass this, then that endpoint is open, and even though you do say I want you to authenticate the users, this endpoint would be open. So it doesn't really secure it until you pass this line. We also have another interesting line here. On line 30, we have context, which is our HTTP context. And then here we say, I want to verify that the user has a scope in their token. This is very important because I could have authenticated against Azure Active Directory and I could be presenting a valid token, but I may not have the right scopes. And that's another layer of security that we're adding by making sure that the user that has authenticated has the appropriate scope or permission to execute something. This is our authorization layer on the application. There you have it. And this can be a number of, because it takes an array, it can be a number of permissions or it can be a single permission. And for example, we have 2 endpoints. We have a map get and a map post. So maybe for the get, we could say, I want to access it as a user, but for posting data and adding data to the endpoint, to our database, we might be saying, I want to access it as admin, or I want to access it as a writer, not just a user or a reader. Therefore, having different permissions to work with. So let's move on to the configuration. Now you can see we have some settings over here, but they're not the right settings. They're from a different demo. In fact, I don't think that these app registrations even exist. So let's go and see how we can automate the process. Working with Azure Active Directory and automating things can happen through the Microsoft Graph. Microsoft Graph is the one API to rule them all. It gives you access to all the Microsoft resources and data through an API, so one consistent API. And therefore, it becomes extremely easy working with, say, OneDrive or Azure Active Directory, like creating Azure Active Directory and configuring Azure Active Directory, or pulling data from SharePoint, or inserting data to your Dynamics, or working with Power BI and all this goodness. So Microsoft Graph comes in all different shapes and flavors. You have SDKs, you have API endpoints. So it all comes down to how you like to work. I find it extremely fun and easy to use .NET notebooks. So this is something new as well. I don't know if you've ever seen notebooks, but notebooks have been traditionally a Python tool that will allow you to intermix Markdown. As you can see here, we have a Markdown, and then you can have some code. And that code is executable in VS Code. It's not executable yet as part of a CI/CD pipeline, so there's no way to call the .NET notebooks through a pipeline. But instead of using a notebook, you could write a small console app that takes a couple of parameters and goes and configures everything for you and dumps them out into some variables that you can later use to populate your app, or just automate your identity configuration process. So here we have we have the two libraries that we need to use. One is the Microsoft Graph, and the other one is the Azure Identity, that allows us to authenticate to Azure, so we can call and create these things. So here we're creating the identity service, and we're using an interactive browser to sign in. So it's not gonna call us for our credential until we do it. Let's change the name here to make it .NET Konf Demo API. We need to have the right permissions to do that. And then for the scope, I'm going to say access as user. Now this can be anything, you can change it, but this needs to match whatever your application is expecting. And our application is expecting an access as user permission. So we need to match this. And with that, we're going to create our API app registration. This is very nice. We get prompted. I'm going to use my Microsoft developer tenant. This makes my life a lot easier because I don't have to use my Microsoft tenant. And I don't know if you ever work with Microsoft tenants, any of you, but it is extremely hard to authenticate users like that. So in fact, we need to change aad.portal.azure.com so I can show you how this works in action. So that's my right developer tenant. Everybody can get a developer tenant. I can send you the link before we hang up. But here, if we come, check this out, .NET Konf Demo API. And if we come back, so that's already been created. If we come back here, you'll see that it has dumped some very interesting settings. And the one I need to care about is my client ID, which identifies which Azure Active Directory app registration I'm using to authenticate. And we're gonna come back here and change this to that. Now, obviously, if this wasn't completed, then it would require me to go and complete everything else. But the nice thing is that my notebook actually dumps everything I need to configure stuff. In fact, I'm going to take my API key from here, and then I'm going to dump it into my Thunder client. So Thunder client is a very funky tool that allows you to, let's come here, let's change the auth, that allows you to do API calls directly from Visual Studio Code. You can see I already have a secret, so do not copy my secret. In fact, that doesn't exist anyway. So that's my scope, which I will need in a second. Let me save this, that's important. So we do have our API details. I'm going now to create a service principal that will allow me to actually use this API. And finally, we need a front-end app registration. The front-end app registration is required so we can authenticate as users and then acquire an access token, that's the flow, to call our API. Without that, we can't call the API. The API will be secure, but we don't have a client. Now, in real world, that could be a web app. That can be another client, like a desktop client that calls that API. It can also be another API that calls the API on behalf of the user. You still have to go through the same process of registering an application, a client application that will call your API. And to make our life easier, we're gonna configure Thunder client to do that for us. So here we have this, and I'm going to run it. Again, it creates the exact same thing. It says create an app registration that can call the API for my user and also registers the right permissions, the right scope. So here I will run it. It's already run. It created that. So we need to grab this and then come back to our Thunder client. So yep, it's here, and we need to put it here in the client ID. And then we need one component, which is the secret. So this secret is invalid because it's an old secret. So let's go and create a secret. And you can do all these through commands. So there you go. It's a beauty. I didn't have to jump into the portal. I didn't have to leave my code. I did everything through automation. In fact, I can share this notebook with my colleagues, and the whole team can configure their apps, or they can grab the same settings if they need to, because there's nothing really sensitive. Now, always make sure to save your app settings, because it always catches me unprepared. That means that we now have an API that is secure, and we have a client that can call that API securely. So let's put this in action. So what do we need to do first? We need to, in fact, you know what? Let's grab that information, because I will need it when we change branches, and I always forget. So we need just the client ID, we need the secret, and we need our API endpoint. I hope I grabbed everything I need. I should have access as user. So I'm putting it into my side notes to make sure that we can access it later. So we have that all saved. We have the API all configured. So actually, let's go and run it. Let's go and run it and see what happens. So we're in the wrong project. We need to be here, and I need to be in a different branch. In fact, let's see, git status. It will say we are in authentication. That's perfect. .NET run. .NET run. So this is going to spin up our API, and then we'll be able to use Thunder client to call it. Perfect. So let's come back here. Let's see what our API can do. So we have volcanoes and a get. So let's go to our code here. Let's do a get, and then we say volcanoes. And then before we call anything, we need to actually grab a token. So I'm going to delete the old token, because obviously it makes no sense to have it here. And we're going to authenticate again. So I'm going to use my test tenant. We need to use the exact same tenant. This is great. Now we need to consent as users. The Azure Active Directory or the Microsoft Identity Platform uses the consent framework to make sure that you are giving the right permissions to the application to access your data. And the developer also gets this kind of trust framework where they say, I'm only going to access your profile. And this is what's happening here. We say, I'm going to access your profile. I'm going to give you offline access for refresh tokens, and I'm going to give you access to the app that you just requested, the API thing, right? So for this one, I'm going to say, yes, I want to accept this. And if everything goes well, we will have acquired the token, the moment of truth. There you go. That's our token. That token is valid for a limited time, usually an hour. And now I can call my API. So this is the response that we got back. You're getting all the volcanoes, which is right. I am getting all the volcanoes because in my code, I have, you're getting all the volcanoes if we don't pass a name. So let's pass a name and see what happens. Let's pass a name test. You're getting result for volcano test. Brilliant. And then we could also do a post, which should be volcano. And then we need a body, demo that. You're about to create a volcano. So we can call both the post and the get, and they're all secure. The nice thing is that if I were to call with a different, let's say we can test that. So if I come back here in auth and change our scope, in fact, rather than doing it here, I'm going to change it in the code because it's easier to demo that. So I'm going to stop the code here. and I'm going to change it to say access as user 2 or access as writer, right? Remember we said different authorization. What do you think will happen if I do that and run the application again? Any ideas, anyone? If you don't know, then it is going to throw a 403, which will say the user is authenticated, but he's also unauthorized, or she's unauthorized to access that endpoint, and we'll prove it in action. So we did change the get endpoint, right? Yes, here. So now, if I call that same endpoint, volcanoes, and say get, because that would be weird, and do a send. Aha! So we did get a 403. That's exactly what we're expecting to get, and it does say that the scope in the token does not contain the right permission. Access as writer was not found, which is perfect. It just tells us that the user has not requested that scope. Obviously, that scope doesn't exist in that resource, and for now, and it doesn't let us go any further, which is great. That's exactly what we want. If people are coming and presenting tokens without the right permissions, even though the tokens are valid, they will get a 403. Fantastic. I hope you're with me so far. So now we have our authentication working, authorization working, which is the first step. Now, how do we eliminate secrets from our application? And that's the next step, because we need to access resources, right? And I mean, it would be highly unlikely that you're creating APIs or any web apps these days, or any apps these days, that don't really access data. And that data can be anywhere. It can be in a SQL server, it can be in storage, it can be in some data lake, they can be in Cosmos, they can be JSON files that you have protected somehow. The whole point is that you need to make sure that access to those resources is taking place through a secure mode. And I wouldn't be surprised if you worked with applications that in the past said, I don't know, API key, right? I don't want that. API key, and then there will be some key, blah, which is super secure and nobody should know about it and it should not be in the config files. And well, you might say, well, I can dump it into my secrets. So if you don't know if you know before, that's fine. We expected that exception. So clear. .NET has the notion of secrets. .NET user secrets, and then it can do help. User search. No, it's user secrets. I told you I need more coffee. So this idea gives you option to take secrets from or store secrets outside of your config files and then access them through the normal config way when you load the config. The problem with this is that first they are stored under your profile in clear text. So if anyone ever was to hack your machine or gain access, unauthorized access, then they can scan your box for well-known locations for those secrets. The other problem with this is that these secrets are not shareable. So you will create them on your machine and then somebody else has to go and do the exact same process and so on and so on and so on. So you still end up with all these scattered secrets all over the place. So what is a better way? Well, ideally we shouldn't be using any secrets to connect to endpoints, and luckily most of the Azure services out there support that through managed identities. A managed identity is an Azure Active Directory backed entity or identity that allows service-to-service communication securely. So if you have a web app on Azure, running on Azure, calling a backend, let's say SQL or Cosmos, then that front end can use a managed identity in the process to actually call the backend without using a secret. And well, technically it does use a secret, but it acquires the secret on the fly through the managed identity and then passes that secret to, or that authentication token to the service client that you're using. So let's see that in action and see how it works. But you might say, well, I'm not always running on Azure because I could be running my API locally as you're demoing right now. So what is the way? How do we do that? Like, how do we make it happen? And that's a great question because we don't have managed identities on our local machines. Well, luckily there's a workaround for this. The Azure the Azure Identity Library, which is part of the Azure SDKs, which allows us to write code to call services. has thought about that, and they give you options to authenticate through other means while you're developing locally. And it allows us to do that without really changing the code. That's the beauty there. So I can say, when I'm developing on my local machine, I want to be able to authenticate through, say, my Visual Studio Code account, or through my Visual Studio account, or through my PowerShell, or through my Azure CLI. And that account should be able to access resources through a service principal. So on my Azure CLI, I can use my account, and then I can use that account to log in and then access resources. So the code will pick it up. And that is fine. The problem with using my account is that it's extremely overprivileged on my Azure tenant. So my account is an owner on that tenant, and many developers will either be owners or contributors to their Azure tenants, and therefore they can create a lot of damage. If that account gets compromised, or if that account has to run a script that is overprivileged, like let's say delete a database, then it could do a lot of damage, because you can actually delete production databases. And I've seen this happen a lot of times. Somebody running in script, assuming that they're running it on the right tenant, and then they end up running it on the wrong subscription and killing a number of services. So to avoid this, we always go with the service principal. So a service principal, again, it's a service account. It's a cloud service account that allows us to authenticate and call other services, but they have to be provisioned. They follow the same rules. They have to use RBAC, and you can create custom policies and ensure that these service principals can only do certain things. So we need to use the least privilege approach here as well. And when we create service principals, we need to make sure that that service principal has very limited access to only the things that we wanted to give it access. I've talked about Cosmos. So Cosmos is one of the latest services that actually added support for RBAC since last March. So it's not new. But the point here is that with the Managed Identity or Service Principal, I can provision the right permissions to my accounts, and then use those accounts to only read or only write data and nothing else. So let's change directories, and I think I've already, excuse me, I have already stored the information I need, and then I'm going to go to my Cosmos branch. I'm going to force checkout, it's fine, delete all files, I don't want any changes to be propagated. So restore, and then I'm going to change this because it's changed now. So, okay, let's record, it's fine. Let's close this and let's see what we've added and how it works. So let's go first into our project and see what's changed. So in my CS Pros, you'll see I've added a couple of libraries. One of them is Azure Identity. That is the one that provides the identity component to our client app. And then I have a client SDK to work with Cosmos. So for this one to be able to access my Cosmos, I would need to pass a connection string, but we said we don't want to do that. So in my config, there's nothing. Wow, you know what? Let's remove that because we don't need it. In my config file, there's nothing that we need here, right? Because yeah, we need to. While we're here, we might as well change this. That's our 6D. Yep, that's the right one. Okay, cool. So let's close this one. You see, no config for our Cosmos. So let's see what the code looks like. Also, you'll notice that I've removed the controllers because there were controllers here. When you do .NET New Web API, it does create controllers for you, but we don't really need the controllers because right now our solution is very small. It only has 2 endpoints. As my application grows, you might want to go back and add controllers and segregate your API endpoints to make it more scalable and easier to work with. So rather than dumping everything into the program, please don't do that. If you have 20 endpoints, it makes no sense to dump everything in here because there will be a lot of code. You will also notice that I actually inlined all my Cosmos calls here, which again, it's not the most graceful way of doing things. So please don't do what I did. This is only for my demo. I even have my classes here. So back to the authentication and security component. So we did say that we want to call Cosmos, and we're using the Cosmos SDK to do that from the Azure SDKs. And we do provide an endpoint. That's the endpoint. However, I don't use an API key or a key, I'm using my token credential. And that token credential is coming from here. So we said that we want to ensure that we lock things down. And I am very explicit about how we're getting our tokens. When I'm developing locally, I will be taking the token from the Azure CLI. And when I move to production, it's going to use my managed identity to do the exact same thing. So here I have this, and let's move to our CLI. I can't remember what I have here in my CLI. So let's see. In my Azure CLI, oh, that's a different endpoint. So here, let me clear this. We can say AZ account. So I need to see how I'm signed in right now. And I'm signed in through a service principal, this 82C1. And this service principal should have access to my Cosmos. In fact, we can check this through a funky script I have. So you can see the script over here. This is all you need to create a service principal, get the right details from that service principal, and assign it role definitions. So this one is saying go and assign a role definition to my Cosmos. Or list existing ones. Yeah, let's go and grab this one because I don't remember if I am using the right service principal. If not, we can fix it. And if you are switching between Mac and .NET, sorry, Mac and Windows, then you might see that we have different paste anyway. So this should run, and this should tell us, yep. So we do have this scope, and this scope is assigned to an identity and A56. I can't remember if this is the right permission or if this is the right account. So ID. And then I'm signed in. If this doesn't work when we run it, we can assign it later. So the way we will do it is we'll come in here and assign the role down here, the principal ID. And that principal ID is different here because I've used it in the past. So hopefully I have everything I need. If it doesn't work, then we know what the problem is. Okay, so with that, we can actually run the app, and then this is going to return actual data. So let's see it in action. Oh, you know what? What do I need? We've changed so make sure the app settings are correct. So that should be through 6D. This is correct, so that is right, but I think our localhost will be different. Is that the same or different? 6D, yeah, that is the right endpoint. And the client ID is right as well. So let's run it. Running and running and running. It gives us some warnings for our endpoints. We could fix this later, but for now, we have our endpoint working. So I'm coming here. I'm gonna do, did I think I had yeah, access as user, so that's fine. So we can say get. There you go. So I have the right service principal signed in, and that has the right permissions to read data from the database. This only has read-only permissions to my database. In fact, if we go back to our code, you'll see that it does have a read-only permission. It's a read-only role, right? So here, you can only read from the container, which is great. So if I come back, I can say I want to get which volcanoes? We get the Akatanengo. Do you guys have any volcanoes where you're from? I didn't know there are so many volcanoes in the world until I started testing this live data. This is real data. It's just insane amount of volcanoes out there. Hopefully none of them will erupt anytime soon. and I was able to get that single endpoint. But what shouldn't work is our post. Remember, I only assigned the built-in role, which is read-only, right? So posting data should fail. So let's see this in action. If I change this to post, and if I say volcano, because that's our endpoint, and if I make sure I have a body, which I do, and call our endpoint, what do you think will happen? Anyone? Well, let's find out. Straight away we got a response back. Now, this response did not come from our authentication middleware, no, because we are validly authenticated and we have the right token. However, our permission that the service principal has is limited to read-only, and therefore the error that came back says that the specific principal that we're using, the service principal account, does not have the required RBAC permissions to perform this action. It means that we only have read-only and we cannot write, which is great. At this point, it gets a little bit tricky because how do you test this in your local environment? You probably need to have two different credential types that you require. One could be Azure PowerShell and the other one could be the Azure CLI, or you can sign out and sign in to test the different endpoints, which is a little bit of a pain. However, when you go into production, then you can use different managed identities. You can have different assigned identities to your system. So rather than just saying, I want to get the system assigned identity to Azure, you can say, I want to get a specific masked identity, and then you can pass the name. It can be like, it's a GUID actually, so like, and then here, you can have multiple token credentials. You can say var read only cred, right? And then you can have new equals new. See, I'm telling you, Copilot is going to steal my job in the end, because look, it took this random thing I put over there, and then obviously doesn't have to be that. That's silly. I know GitHub Copilot is trying to be clever, but it doesn't work like that. And then you can have var write only cred equals new minus identity credential. And then you can do the same thing. That will be a different string, obviously. It will be a different GUID, blah. And it's supposed to be a string. It's not JavaScript. So let's make it right. And therefore, when it comes to working with your Cosmos client, you will instantiate a different Cosmos client with a different endpoint, with a different credential. So here you'll say, I will need the read-only cred. That's how you would do it in production. As I said, testing is a little bit harder, but that's how you do it in production. And then rather than doing masked identity directly, you will still do chain token credentials, so you can pass the different service principals you want and make them configurable. So as you can see, it's fairly straightforward to do that. I have no secrets anywhere, and I can still apply the same policies and the same securities that I need. And my application is secure. I could have also access to storage, and I can also have access to other components. In fact, I have a node demo that shows exactly this using managed identities, service principals, and authentication components with Node. So it doesn't matter which language you use, because the principle and the pattern is exactly the same. There will be a Cosmos client for whichever language you want to use, and then there will be the endpoints and the credential that you need to pass. And that credential is exactly the same on whichever language you use. So this is it in a few lines of code. I mean, the authentication and authorization components have been very, very small. Like they have taken very few lines of code to do. So as long as you know what you're doing, token credential. Oh, how do you create a service principal? You might ask. Well, you can create service principals as long as you have the right permissions. Let's stop this one. Let's clear. You can say AZADSP. So Azure Active Directory, service principal, create AZADSP. Obviously AS is not going to give us anything. I was like, well, that doesn't make any sense. AZADSP create, and you can say for RBAC, In fact, we can check this because I was creating that yesterday. I created an Azure Devops agent, and I needed to use a service principal. We gave it contributor rights, which is probably quite a bit. You need to check the resource that you want and make sure that it has the right and the limited amount of permissions. And then you always need to give it a scope. So in this instance, it is a contributor, but it's only a contributor to a specific resource group. Never do it to the whole subscription unless you have a very good reason to do so. But maybe you have, again, an agent that needs to create resource groups and create resources in those resource groups. That's probably the only case where you would need a contributor right at the whole subscription. But I usually like to lock it down to a resource group. And then you can also lock it down into a specific resource within that resource group. So I could lock it down into just the Key Vault stuff, which is what I did for my Key Vault. And then once you do that, it dumps out something like, let me just copy that and remove the secret because this will be recorded and people will be able to see it afterwards. I don't want them to come and dox me. I do clean my service principals, by the way. In fact, just because I deleted everything I had the last time. So probably not here, but we can dump it somewhere, I don't know, in the JSON file somewhere. There you go. So when you run this command, it will come back with this, plus a much larger password, longer password. And that's all you need for, in fact, this is the one we're using for signing into our reader stuff. So this is it. Let me see. So we have that. That's how you create service principals. You can also list them, which is always very handy. And home, AZADSP list. And then you can say show mine. Otherwise, it would list every service principal in my tenant. And I would do work on the Microsoft tenant, so there will be a few thousand. I will be sitting here all day. But I'm only going to say show mine. Resource not found. Oh yeah, you know why it's not found? Because I'm using a service principal. AZ account show. So that service principal doesn't have permissions to list anything. If I were signed in as myself, then I would be able to see all these. I did talk about the tenants that you can get, the free Azure tenants. So this is a full P2 Azure AD tenant with some sample data that I can use all the time when I need to authenticate and test things around. I don't have to go through Microsoft Microsoft IT to give me permissions, because that is a lengthy process if I need to do so. And I suspect in some companies that can be even more locked down. So if you go to Microsoft M365 developer program, you can see I've already searched for it. And I mean, I talk about it all the time. You can go and sign up for a tenant for free. It's free forever. You don't have to pay anything. And as long as you use it every 90 days, that always renews and comes back to you. So there you go. And if you want to see the source code, I do have all that under, not here. It will be under here. That's my own. And I do have some samples here and some code, but usually these days we dump everything under the 45 which is where we do most of our work. So you can see this demo that we're playing with today, it's all here. Make sure to choose the right branch because, you know, we iterated through the different configs, but we have everything here. You have the .NET notebook, you have your Cosmos custom roles, you even have, if you want to use that, or you can use the script here to create everything. And then all the code can be found here. So make sure to do that. Earmark the AKWMS45. And again, if you enjoyed what you saw today, and if you want to learn more, then please do make sure to follow us on the 45 show. There's also a very active Discord community that you can join to ask questions about Azure and identity. And I hope you learned something interesting today. I mean, it's always nice for me to present these things and show you how to build more secure apps. If you have any questions, make sure to reach out. My name should be, if you can see my name, then I also have my Twitter handle. So you can always reach out to me on Twitter if you want to. I'm fairly active there as well. Thank you.
Christos, big thank you. Have a nice weekend. Sorry disturbing you on Saturday. But it was pleasure. Really, we enjoyed with all second of your demo. Thank you. Currently,
Thank you very much.
there is no any questions. In case any, probably our colleagues and community will use your social networks or GitHub link to ask these questions. Have a nice evening. Have a nice day. You have a whole day in front of you.
Thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of your evening and the rest of the conference. I
By the
appreciate
way,
that.
in Azerbaijan, we have mood volcanoes. So we don't have real volcanoes, but we have a mood volcanoes.
Perfect. Thank you.
Thank you.